Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Before we get started, please hit the like button if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can also join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and I will talk about that at the end of the video. Once in a while, a story comes along that reminds us some of the most evil and dangerous people are in our own families, our own friend circles. Statistically, if you are murdered, your killer is most likely someone you know. We all know that at this point. But getting murdered is still not a typical way to die. You're much more likely to be killed by a heart attack or by your car than you are an axe-wielding maniac. Also, statistically, you are safest at home. So what happens when one house becomes the scene of death after death after death? How can one location become the site where so many people, healthy people, young people, are found dead when the house becomes a house of horrors? This disturbing story has a very recent update that we will discuss at the end of the episode. This is the story of the Harrison family and the deaths and murders that took place in their house on Pitch Pine Crescent. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's get into it. August 2000. Melissa Merritt had just graduated from high school in Mississauga, a city in Ontario, Canada. After spending the summer partying with friends and taking some time to herself, she knew it was time to get a job. She began working here at a store called My Favorite Doll, which is a large retailer in Mississauga that specializes in Barbie dolls. The store is on Argentina Road and specializes in Barbie dolls that you cannot get anywhere else. She is a local girl, well known in the area, pleasant, nice smile, and perhaps a little naive and sheltered. She was at the time, anyway. Attached to the storefront was a warehouse, and there was a young man who worked in the warehouse that caught Melissa's eye. His name was Caleb Harrison, and the two had an instant attraction. Caleb had thick dark hair, beautiful skin, kind of a mischievous smile, and he was very soft-spoken. He was smart and well-respected for being a hard worker, and he also had a soft spot for the ladies. He'd been adopted as a baby in 1973 by this couple, Bill and Bridget Harrison, and he was an only child. Caleb and Melissa began to date, and once they did, they were inseparable. Very soon, Caleb was driving Melissa to and from work, and they were often seen kissing in the car outside the store. They even took their lunch breaks together, and at night, Melissa would cook dinner for Caleb. He was older than she was by quite a bit. Melissa was 18, Caleb was 27, and after 2 years, Caleb and Melissa were married. For a while, things were great. They were happy and they were thriving. And then Melissa got pregnant. By 2004, the couple had 2 beautiful children, Mason and Michaela. But things were not as good as they appeared on the surface. Caleb and Melissa fought, and some of the fights were violent. One night in 2005, things were especially bad, and Caleb and Melissa broke up for good after Caleb became abusive and violent. After that fight, something seemed to switch in Melissa. After that 2000 fight, there was no going back for her, which is good if you're with someone violent. But it was more than that. She began to really hate Caleb, and she decided that she didn't want Caleb around the kids anymore. She told people he was an unfit father, and she told people that he didn't deserve to spend time with the kids. After the breakup, Caleb moved in with his parents, Bill and Bridget, and tried to start his life over. He was 40 years old by this time, so that was no small task. He did begin dating a woman named Corinda McEwen, and she had 2 children of her own. Things seemed to be going well for Caleb, and then he really messed up. After a night of heavy drinking, Caleb smashed his car into a taxi and he killed the driver. Now, this is Canada, so he got 18 months behind bars for killing someone in a drunk driving accident. Very, very different than here in the States. You'd get 15 to 20 years. While Caleb was in jail, his parents shared custody of the grandkids with Melissa, And his parents doted on those kids. They were really involved and really in love with them. But as the time grew for Caleb to be released from jail, Melissa began filing all of these complaints, complaint after complaint, with Children's Services about Caleb, claiming that he was not caring, he didn't love the children, he wasn't supportive of them, and she felt he needed to be completely removed from their lives. Now, Caleb was in jail for doing something really, really bad, so some of her claims were taken pretty seriously. Authorities would look into them, but each time Melissa's claims made it to family court, they were thrown out for lack of evidence. Judge after judge found Caleb to be not only active and invested in his children's lives, but completely devoted to the kids. The kids were interviewed. They loved their dad. And in these interviews, the family court authorities found that Melissa had been coaching the kids to say terrible things about their father and their grandparents. I think that is just pure evil. You know, there is nothing worse than a parent who manipulates their kids into hating the other parent or family members. I think it's evil. Melissa then began a relationship with this man, Christopher Fattore, and they had children together. Chris even went on a social media campaign against Caleb. On his Facebook, he posted a photo of Caleb that he'd altered to have devil horns, and he wrote, "This is the dick that killed someone drinking and driving. He's unfortunately also my wife's ex-husband." Yeah, not a great move. Chris and Melissa never married legally. In fact, she and Caleb never legally divorced. That might have been what was bothering Chris. I don't know. But then Chris posted a photo of Caleb with like a speech bubble saying, "Give me a beer and the keys to mommy's Mercedes." Chris hated Caleb, seeing him as a spoiled rich kid who always got his way. He and Melissa continued to make accusations against the Harrisons, and those accusations got worse with each court filing. Finally, the courts ruled that Melissa was filing frivolous claims, and that ended with Melissa and Caleb having joint custody of the children. This sent Melissa into a rage. She became angrier than ever, but no one, not Caleb, not Bill, not Bridget, was aware of just how angry Melissa was or what she was capable of doing. After they got joint custody, Melissa made the claims that Bridget, Caleb's mother, had been abusing the children, but those claims were found to be wholly without merit. Bridget was very, very angry that Melissa had made such serious accusations against her, and the tensions grew. Christopher Fattore, Melissa's new partner, only made things worse. He could often be seen making mocking gestures at Caleb and his parents inside the courtroom whenever the group had to go to court over another of Melissa's allegations. The judge even stopped the proceedings once and told Christopher to stop making eye contact with Caleb and his parents or he was going to be removed. So it kind of feels from an outside perspective as though Melissa and Chris were the antagonizers in the situation. Not saying the other side is perfect, but at some point, you know, I think she filed like 12 or 15 claims or something. At some point, you know, it's got to stop. As bad as this had all turned, it was nothing compared with what was to come. April 16th, 2009.
What's your emergency?
My husband, I just came home from work and I found him collapsed on the bathroom floor.
What city do you need the ambulance in?
I beg your pardon?
What city?
Mississauga.
What's the address?
3635 Pitch Pine Crescent.
What you just heard was Bridget Harrison calling 911 for help. She had come home to an empty and quiet house and began calling for her husband, Bill. She got no answer. She went to the bathroom door and found it locked. She forced her way inside, and there she found Bill dead on the bathroom floor of the home. There were no signs of physical trauma, no gunshot, no knife wound, just a fractured sternum, and that could have happened with a fall. Bridget was shocked, and so were the people who knew Bill. He was in his 60s, but he was healthy and active. He didn't have any medical problems, so his death was very surprising. His body was removed, and a pathologist declared that Bill had died of acute cardiac arrhythmia. Caleb was still serving his sentence in jail for drunk driving when his father died. On the same day that Bill Harrison was found dead, Melissa and Chris packed up their entire family, which of course included the 2 Harrison kids, as well as 4 other children they had together, and they went on the run. Well, in America, we would have called it going on the run. In Canada, they called it a custody violation. Didn't anyone think it was super suspicious that the day someone Melissa and Chris hated was found dead, they split town? So Melissa and Chris, along with the 6 kids, disappeared into Alberta, and they were there for months. The police were looking for them and had paperwork prepared to extradite the adults back to Ontario. After a few months in Alberta, Melissa and Chris moved again to Nova Scotia. Can you imagine how hard this was on the kids? Are they even in school? They're just being dragged around all the time by these 2 lunatics. No stable home, no more grandparents. It's really sad for them. Finally, on November 27th, 2009, the police were able to take Melissa and Chris into custody. Chris, who had taken on a new identity, had a lapse of memory and forgot he wasn't Christopher Fattore anymore. He filled out the family's rent check and delivered it to the landlord. He used the name Christopher Fattore on the check. The landlord didn't know him as Christopher Fattore, so I don't know if the landlord called the police, but it somehow triggered the arrest warrant, and the police were able to locate Melissa, Chris, and the kids. Authorities put them on a plane and sent them back to Ontario to stand trial for abducting the kids. Bridget was then given sole custody of Mason and Michaela while their mother was in jail. The fact that Bridget had her kids only made Melissa hate Bridget even more. This was a very angry and controlling woman who was very triggered by anything that had to do with Caleb's side of the family. In the end, the attorneys worked out a deal and Melissa was given house arrest. She wasn't allowed to leave her home, and Bridget was in charge of when Melissa was allowed to see her own children. And as you can imagine, that did not go over well with Melissa. Caleb was released from jail a few months later, and that's when he decided he was going to seek sole custody. He felt that he had a strong case against Melissa, seeing as how she had abducted her own kids and run away with them for 7 months. Caleb wanted to raise the kids with the help of his mother, and this sent Melissa and Christopher into a fury. It appears that Melissa, too, was worried about Caleb getting full custody after what she had done. I mean, let's be honest, there's barely a strong parent between the 2 of them. They've both committed very serious crimes and they've both been in prison at this point. So it was kind of anybody's ball game as to who was going to get the kids. And both Caleb and Melissa were nervous about it. Obviously, the best thing to do would have been to work something out and split custody, but they were so entrenched in their positions, they were ready for war. Caleb had another strike against Melissa. Bridget had caught Melissa leaving the house several times when she was on house arrest. And each time, Bridget had contacted Melissa's parole agent and reported the violation. Of course, this just made Melissa madder, but it also created a paper trail and gave more weight to Bridget and Caleb's claim that Melissa was still engaged in criminal activity. Both parties could have chosen to seek joint custody, but cooler heads never prevailed. They were both apparently quite concerned they would lose full custody, but nevertheless, they both completed their court filings, and a hearing to determine custody was set for April 22nd, 2010. Before that could happen, there would be another death. April 21st, 2010. One day before the scheduled custody hearing where Bridget Harrison was set to testify against her former daughter-in-law and her new partner, her 8-year-old grandson walked into the house after school and found Bridget dead at the bottom of the stairs. Her skin was waxy and her body was cold. Mason ran to the neighbor's house and they called 911. Bridget had sustained severe injuries to her neck and some injuries around her head, and she was lying at the foot of the main staircase in the home. Her chin was propped up on the bottom step, and her glasses and her purse were laying beside her. It looked as if she was probably headed out of the house. For a second time, the police were called to the location, and as EMTs and forensics crew gathered at the scene, they realized they had been to this house just 1 year, almost to the day before. The day when Bridget found Bill dead in the bathroom. For a second time, a body was taken from the house on Pitch Pine Crescent, and an investigation was underway. The conclusion was, in my opinion, shocking. This is a woman who was scheduled to testify in a custody case. The next morning, a custody case that was so fraught with anger and fighting that the mother had kidnapped the kids and done jail time for it, and apparently none of that factored into the investigation. The pathologist reported that there was no forensic evidence linking any of the family members to Bridget's death. An expert on falls in the home added to the report, saying that Bridget had fallen down the stairs and died from injuries sustained in the fall, with the final finding being death by neck compression. Her neck was broken, and so were several of her ribs, but the compression suggested strangulation. Someone in the police department said compression is different than a broken neck, and after a bit more investigation, the manner of death was changed from natural to suspicious. They did not yet have enough to label it a homicide. Police decided they needed to talk to Melissa Fattore.
I think it's weird that she passed away like a week after Bill. Like it was almost like a week between the anniversary of, I don't know what you call it, but say the anniversary of Bill passing away. He had passed away for 1 year, and then I think it was almost like a week later that she had passed away. I think that's odd. But, you know, you kind of, then when you start thinking about it, it's like, well, it was a year anniversary since her husband passed away. Maybe, you know, like I said, I've heard the stress killed. I've heard, you know, like it can kill you. It can just eat away at your body or whatever. I've been told that because I've been stressed out, you know, since my kids were taken from me, and my doctor's like, you need to take it easy, like, because it'll kill you. Like, I have ulcers now that I'm on medication for.
I was going to ask, are you on medication?
Yeah, so because I'm just always worrying, and I don't see them, and I'm stressed out about everything that's going on, and, you know, he's like, you'll get sick, like, from the stress. It'll just eat away at your body, and you'll just shut down. Me being different, I'm, you know, a 30-year-old woman compared to a 63-year-old woman, but, you know, whatever. So, you know, like when I thought about it, I was like, that's really weird. Like that close of a time span, you know? Yeah. But then sometimes, like, then I'm thinking, well, maybe the 1 year anniversary, you get upset again. You feel like you go through that remorse again. I don't know.
Yeah.
As to, like, you know, when I don't know anything that would have happened to her, I've got, you know, my worries about things, but.
And what would those worries be?
Well, not so much worries, just when I was with Caleb, you know, I don't want to be like, you know, I've already been told by Detective Amoroso that fingers are being pointed, and I'm not in any way pointing fingers, because that's not why I'm here. But when I was with Caleb, he didn't have a good relationship with his mom.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that's enough to do something to her, but he didn't have a great relationship with his mom. They had, you know, they would argue a lot. I know that they had a rough, you know, growing up stage where they wouldn't get along. I don't know. Like, and again, I don't know how she died. I don't know what she looked like. I don't know if she was assaulted. I don't know if she looked I don't know anything about that. So I don't want to be making any assumptions that he beat the hell out of her and she died, because I don't know. Like, I don't know what she looked like. You know, like if, you know, her face was all bashed in, then maybe it would be a little bit more stronger of a thought.
The police began to go through Chris and Melissa's computer. The Google searches were for things like, what if a grandparent has legal custody and they die? Also, if a grandparent has custody of the children and they die, which of the parents gets the kids? Chris and Melissa had also Googled Bridget Harrison, Mississauga, over and over. One of the searches inquired as to how long it takes someone to die from being choked. Then police found the statement Bridget had prepared to read at the custody hearing on the day after she was murdered. It described the horrible year she had had since Bill's death, and it talked about the fact that on the day of his death, Melissa and Chris had abducted the kids. Her statement said, "Some people believe in coincidences, some people do not." 5 days after Bridget's death, the courts granted Caleb sole custody of his 2 children. Melissa would now be allowed to see them only during supervised visits. Melissa and Chris picked up and moved from Mississauga to Perth, near London, Ontario, and there they rented a farm. Chris got a job at a poultry plant, and Melissa started making crafts at home and selling them on her Etsy shop that she called The Good Old Days. She and Chris also started a blog about their daily life. They talked about raising the kids on the farm. After all of this, Caleb was still willing to work with Melissa, and he even offered her some unsupervised visits with the kids. The kids ended up going to stay for a week with Melissa and then a week with Caleb. How does that work for school? If you want to move away from where the kids' base is, you're not going to see the kids. You know what I mean? That was their choice to move away. How is it the kids' responsibility to go 1 week here, 1 week here, different schools, different towns? I don't even know any judge that would allow that. It's too disruptive for the kids' lives. Melissa and Chris made the choice to move away. They should not have the kids during the week. This is just my paralegal brain. I've done too many divorces. But on the outside, Chris and Melissa made sure it all looked really good. They took all of the kids to Niagara Falls. They made videos and they posted them online. They'd also had another child since Bill's death. So now there were 5 of theirs and 2 of the Harrison kids. And then Melissa became pregnant again. While she was pregnant with her 6th child, tragedy struck again. On the morning of March 1st, 2012, Melissa and Chris woke up to the kids banging on their bedroom door. The house was on fire. Thankfully, they were able to get all of the kids out of the house, but they lost their dogs, their guinea pigs, and their rabbits. They had to move into a hotel, and they started a GoFundMe asking for $50,000. I think they only raised about $5,000 of that. So with their house now gone, Chris and Melissa decided to move back to Mississauga. But Caleb had changed his mind on the visitation. I don't know why. He no longer wanted Melissa to have the kids for a week at a time. Seems it would be easier for her to have the kids a week at a time with her now living in the same town as him. Melissa and Chris moved back to Mississauga anyway and set about creating a new home for them and for their kids. Caleb was working a job at CMC Electronics and he was still with his girlfriend, Corinda. He'd never gotten his driver's license back after the DUI, but he had a neighbor that would take him to and from work and even help out with the kids. He was doing okay, but it was a lot. And friends said he would often talk about being depressed. I mean, he'd lost both of his parents and his entire support system. I'm sure that was very difficult. Now Melissa was back in town and the fighting started all over again about how often she was going to see the kids. And then the strangest thing happened. I bet you will never guess what. Just like before, when times get tough for Melissa Fattore and she doesn't get what she wants, someone dies. August 22nd, 2013. Caleb Harrison took his kids to their baseball game and dropped them off to be with Melissa for a few days. Corinda was supposed to meet Caleb there at the ball game and spend the night at his house afterwards, but she was taking an online course and she needed to study. Caleb did not have good internet service at his house and Corinda didn't trust it. So Caleb called Corinda at 11 o'clock on the night of the 22nd and told her he was about to put on a movie. Then they got into some kind of an argument about money and about the house and they hung up on each other. Caleb turned his phone off, which is something he did always at night. The next morning, the cleaning lady who had worked at the house for years arrived to do her tasks. She was in the house for about 2.5 hours when the doorbell rang. At the door was a friend of Caleb's from work, and he was concerned that Caleb hadn't shown up for work and he wasn't answering his phone. The housekeeper's face went pale, and she told the coworker to follow her. They walked up the stairs and got to Caleb's bedroom door, and the housekeeper said, "I don't want to look, I'm scared." And it almost was like, after so many deaths occurring in the house too, at that point, yeah. So the housekeeper and the friend knocked on Caleb's bedroom door, but there was no answer. The coworker opened the bedroom door, and there they found Caleb dead on his bed. His friend checked for a pulse, and there was none. He was cold to the touch. Unbelievably, for a third time, the same 2 paramedics arrived at the same house, and for a third time, they had to pronounce another member of the Harrison family dead before removing their bodies from the house on Pitch Pine Crescent. This time was different, though. Caleb Harrison had very obviously been murdered. The county had also changed pathologists, and the new pathologist was more efficiently trained. They quickly ruled that Caleb had died by strangulation, asphyxia. Suddenly, the previous deaths were also back under investigation. Bill had been cremated. There was no hope of re-examining his body, but Bridget's records were pulled. The records of her injuries were pulled and re-examined, and they also took scrapings from underneath Caleb's fingernails and sent them off for testing. The police put Chris and Melissa under surveillance. As they watched Chris, he tossed a coffee cup from Tim Hortons into the trash. The police retrieved it and bagged it as evidence. Another cop posing as a garbage man collected the trash from Chris and Melissa's house. In that trash was a brand new pair of sneakers and some latex gloves. The sneakers had come from Walmart, so the police went to Walmart and asked them to pull the surveillance tape from the store. On that tape was Chris purchasing the brand new sneakers he then threw away the next day. What was the day? The day before Caleb's murder. Police then uncovered all of the nasty text messages and emails between Melissa, Chris, and Bridget. When Melissa tried to attend Caleb's wake, she was turned away by the family. Now, with full custody of the kids, Melissa and Chris packed up their 8 children and moved back to Nova Scotia. They spent the fall and the winter living by the ocean, and then in January of 2014, the police came for them. Finally, the cops had been building their case, and now it was time for the arrests. Both Chris and Melissa were taken into custody. Both were taken to the police station, and they were placed in separate interrogation rooms. Melissa sat in hers and cried. Christopher talked off and on for a while, and then he made a full confession. He took all the blame, saying that he had snuck out in the middle of the night without Melissa knowing and gone to Caleb's house. He crept into Caleb's filthy bedroom that he had never let the cleaning lady into, and it was a mess. The carpet was so dirty, it was covered with a thick layer of dog hair. Well, that same dog hair had been found on the bottoms of Chris's sneakers that he'd thrown in the trash. Chris apparently stood over Caleb and began hitting him in the chest as hard as he could. Caleb shot up out of bed and there was some sort of a struggle, but Caleb was drunk and he was a slight man. Chris was a massive man, over 300 pounds. He threw Caleb across the room as he begged for his life, even offering to pay Chris to let him live. Chris put his hands around Caleb's neck and began to strangle him. Caleb clawed at Chris's hands, but there was no hope for him. Chris squeezed until there was no longer a pulse, and then he released Caleb's neck, leaving bruises around the children's names he had tattooed there. Then Chris admitted to police he had also killed Bridget. He said he'd gone to her house under the guise of giving Bridget a letter the children had written. Bridget wouldn't take it from Chris, so he pushed his way inside the house. There he attacked Bridget and strangled her to death. The fact that a pathologist missed this is shocking to me. Really poor forensics work. Chris continued to talk to the police and told the police that all of the murders, all of the killings were his idea, that Melissa knew nothing about his terrible actions. That was his claim.
I didn't like Caleb Harrison. I didn't like the way he treated my kids. I didn't like hearing all the horrific stories. It was an awful family. They treated the children like shit. And I and Melissa had to live with it every day, and I couldn't watch Melissa's attitude and how sorry she was for everything that was going on. And I'm telling you right now that Melissa Merritt did not know anything until after it was done.
What did you do?
I killed Bridget Harrison and Caleb Harrison.
How did you kill Bridget?
I knocked on her door. She opened the door. And pretended to have a letter to give to the children. She refused the letter, so I then forced my way into the house and I attacked her.
What did you do?
I hit her a couple of times. I then proceeded to squeeze her neck. Until she stopped breathing and laid on the floor. I never meant to find him. I never meant to find her. That's not the plan. That's not what I wanted. I figured that someone would come home or Caleb would come home and find her. I didn't expect for to come to the house. I didn't think that was going to happen.
I know that.
And as for Caleb, I snuck out in the middle of the night. Melissa had no idea. I left, I went there. I got into his house. proceeded to go up to the bedroom. I hit him in the chest, and when he sprung up, we began to struggle. I threw him into the shelving unit beside his bed. He tried to bribe me with money. I didn't speak to him. I just knocked him to the ground and then proceeded to choke him.
In January of 2018, Chris and Melissa went on trial. As the trial continued, a recording was played. On that recording, Chris and Melissa are put in the same room. They didn't know they were being recorded. Melissa asks, "What did you tell them?" Chris replies, "I'm taking the rap for it to get you a lesser, to give you accessory after the fact. I told them I told you after." Melissa says, "Why did you do that?" And Chris said, "Because I want you to get our children." The whole thing was recorded. In the end, both Melissa and Chris were convicted for the murder of Caleb Harris. Chris was also convicted of murdering Bridget Harrison. The jury could not come to a verdict on Melissa's charge for murdering Bridget, so there was a mistrial declared. Chris was also tried for the murder of Bill Harrison, even though he claimed he had nothing to do with that. He was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. So to this day, we do not know if Bill Harrison died of natural causes or if he was murdered. And because he was cremated, there was no way to go back and look at the body again. Melissa and Chris were both given life sentences with no parole for 25 years. Their children were sent to live with Melissa's family. There aren't any updates on how any of the kids are doing, but I do feel really sorry for those kids and I hope they're doing okay. But there is a major update on this case. First off, Chris and Melissa divorced, and Melissa married a woman who used to be a guard at the prison where she is housed. In January of this year, 2023, a judge ordered that Melissa Merritt will receive a new trial. She won an appeal based on the jury instructions that were given to the jury regarding the recorded conversation between she and Chris when they didn't know they were being recorded. The judge ruled that the Crown had no direct evidence implicating Melissa and that the original judge misstated the facts about that evidence, alluding to the secret recording being proof that Melissa was involved, when actually that decision should have been left up to the jury. Melissa's conviction has been set aside and a retrial has been ordered. Melissa applied for bail as she awaits that new trial, but in April of 2023, bail was denied. So as of right now, Melissa sits behind bars waiting for her new trial date. You know that I will update you as this progresses, and we will have to see what happens. I certainly don't think she deserves to be released. This is a terrible and tragic case where so many people ended up being hurt, and so many ended up having their lives changed forever. It's a story about selfishness and big egos, and what happens when people dig their heels in and refuse to work together, refuse to compromise, and refuse to get along. Those are things that have become all too common in our daily lives, and I sure wish we could get back to working through things with those we disagree with instead of screaming and name-calling and threatening. In the end, it only hurts us all. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. In the end, we have a big goal, and it's this. We would like to raise money to donate to police departments who have cold case DNA in storage that has never been tested because there's no money to test it. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested. We would like to raise the money, pick the case, and get the DNA tested in hopes of solving that crime. The other thing that happens is we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever. If they've committed other crimes, someone else might get a hit. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you have lots of options for things to watch, so the fact that you spend a little bit of your day with me, it means a lot. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.